On the surface, it was the kind of small southern town that people dreamed about retiring to. A place where the air smelled faintly of magnolia blossoms, where church bells rang faithfully on Sunday mornings, and where neighbors waved at one another from their porches as if time itself had slowed down. Folks here prided themselves on two things: their faith and their families. And to anyone looking in from the outside, Henry and Sarah Collins seemed to embody both. Henry Collins was a man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered from years of factory work, with a face lined by both labor and the steady respect he carried in town. He was the man you saw every Sunday in the third pew at the Baptist church, his arm draped protectively around his wife. He was the man who shoveled the neighbor's driveway in the winter without being asked, who offered his truck to haul furniture for friends. To the town, Henry was a pillar, one of those men who gave the impression of reliability, of steadfast decency. Sarah, his wife, was gentle and soft-spoken, the kind of woman who seemed born to nurture. At 38, she still carried a girlish beauty in her smile, a glow that seemed to come not from vanity but from kindness. She worked part-time at the local library, where she greeted every visitor like an old friend. She cooked Sunday dinners big enough to feed half the congregation and always had a pitcher of sweet tea chilling in the fridge. To her, marriage was sacred. She believed her love with Henry was the kind of story their parents' generation spoke about with pride: steady, faithful, enduring. Living with them for a season was Melissa, Sarah's younger sister. She was in her late 20s, striking in her own way. Taller, more daring in fashion, with a spirit that often clashed with the conservative tone of the town. Melissa had fallen on hard times after losing a job in the city, and Sarah, ever the caretaker, insisted she move in until she could get back on her feet. Neighbors whispered that Melissa was too wild, too restless, but Sarah defended her fiercely. "She's my sister. Family takes care of family." The Collins home became a picture of ordinary Southern life. Neighbors passing by in the evening could hear laughter spilling from the porch, or the sound of Sarah humming as she watered the garden. Dinner at the Collins table was a ritual, Sarah serving her famous roast chicken, Henry bowing his head to lead grace, Melissa chiming in with sarcastic quips that made everyone laugh despite themselves. To anyone watching, it was warm, inviting, safe. But under that roof, something darker was stirring, a secret waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. One evening, after dinner, Sarah leaned across the table, her eyes soft with gratitude. "Henry," she said with a tender smile, "I don't say this enough, but I'm blessed to have you. You've been my rock all these years." Henry, caught mid-bite, looked up at her. For a split second, a flicker of guilt, or was it fear, crossed his face. He forced a smile, set down his fork, and reached for her hand. "And I'm blessed to have you too," he replied, his voice steady but his eyes darting briefly toward Melissa, who sat silently at the end of the table, her expression unreadable. Moments like these were ordinary to everyone else, but if one looked closer, the cracks were already forming. Henry's laugh sometimes came a second too late. Melissa's eyes lingered too long when she thought no one was watching. And Sarah, trusting to the very bone, saw none of it. The church community admired the Collins family. Pastor Williams often pointed them out as examples of strong Christian marriage. At the annual church picnic, Sarah made her peach cobbler, Henry helped string the tents, and Melissa wandered among the crowd with her restless energy. The Collins name carried weight, a good family, people would say. But the truth had already begun to eat away inside that house like termites chewing through the beams, invisible until the collapse came. Older folks in town used to say that storms never announce themselves. They build quietly on the horizon until, all at once, the sky splits open. That's how it was for the Collins family. While the world saw a portrait of devotion and stability, within those walls temptation had already crept in. What looked like harmony was laced with silence. What looked like loyalty was balanced on lies. For Sarah, this was still the season of faith and certainty. She adored her husband, defended her sister, and believed love could weather anything. She had no way of knowing that the two people she trusted most were already on the path to betrayal. She could not imagine that the home she decorated with flowers and prayers would soon become the scene of unspeakable tragedy. As the cicadas buzzed in the summer night, and as Henry kissed her forehead before bed, Sarah closed her eyes with the peace of a woman who thought her life was safe secure, and blessed. But the storm was already gathering, quiet, invisible, merciless. And before long, it would tear apart not only her marriage but her very life. It started as a glance. Nothing more than an accidental meeting of eyes across the kitchen table, a moment so fleeting that Sarah never noticed. But for Henry, that look lingered. And for Melissa, it sparked something she should have pushed aside but didn't. Living under the same roof blurred boundaries. Sarah often worked late hours at the library, shelving books until dusk, while Henry came home tired from the factory. Melissa, between job applications and restless afternoons, was often there when he walked through the door. She would greet him with a casual, "Hey, Henry," her voice carrying that mix of playfulness and defiance she'd had since she was a teenager. At first, Henry ignored it. He busied himself with chores, sat in his recliner with the evening paper, and told himself that what he felt was just exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But temptation has a way of circling, pressing closer, whispering in the quiet moments. One night, after Sarah had gone to bed, Henry found himself in the kitchen, pouring a glass of water. Melissa slipped in behind him, barefoot, her hair loose, the hem of her t-shirt brushing mid-thigh. "You always this restless at night?" she teased, leaning against the counter. Henry avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the faucet. "Couldn't sleep. Long day." Melissa smirked. "Guess Sarah's the lucky one. She can sleep through anything." Her words landed heavy, like a dare. Henry should have walked away, but instead he found himself chuckling, shaking his head. "You've always had a smart mouth. And you've always noticed," Melissa shot back softly. That was the first night the silence between them became dangerous. The days turned into weeks, and the tension grew like a fire left smoldering. Small things fed it. Melissa brushing past him in the hallway, her hand grazing his arm a second too long. Henry stealing glances when Sarah's back was turned. Late-night conversations in the living room that ended only when Sarah's footsteps sounded upstairs. For Sarah, these moments were invisible. She believed in her husband, and she trusted her sister. She had no reason to doubt either of them. On Sunday mornings, she pressed her hand proudly into Henry's as they sat in church. On weeknights, she invited Melissa to join them for dinner, delighted that her family could feel whole again. She had no idea that beneath the laughter, another current was pulling them under. It happened on a night Sarah went out of town for a library conference. She kissed Henry goodbye at the door, told Melissa to keep an eye on the house, and drove off with a suitcase in the back seat. The silence in the house that night was different. Melissa lounged on the couch with a glass of wine, her legs tucked under her. Henry sat stiff in the recliner, flipping through television channels without seeing a thing. "You're wound up," Melissa observed. Henry sighed. "Feels strange without her here." Melissa tilted her head, studying him. "Or maybe it feels easier." The room seemed to close in. Henry put down the remote, his chest tightening. "Melissa, don't." "Don't what?" she whispered, sliding closer on the couch. "Pretend you don't feel it too?" Henry shook his head, but when she leaned in, the last barrier crumbled. Their lips met, hesitant at first, then desperate, fueled by months of suppressed desire. When it was over, when the quiet of the house returned, Henry sat at the edge of the bed he had shared with Sarah for years. Melissa lay beside him, tangled in sheets, her breathing steady. "What have we done?" he whispered, his voice raw. Melissa reached for his hand. "Something we can't take back." The affair became their secret sin. Nights when Sarah worked late, they stole moments. When Sarah ran errands, they exchanged hurried touches. Every laugh at the dinner table became tinged with guilt. Every Sunday service felt heavier, the sermons about betrayal and sin slicing into their hearts. Henry knew it was wrong. He knew he was risking everything. His marriage, his reputation, his soul. But sin rarely feels like sin when it promises escape. And for Henry, Melissa was intoxicating. She made him feel alive in ways Sarah no longer did. For Melissa, it was more complicated. Part rebellion, part longing for something forbidden, part resentment of living in her sister's shadow. She told herself she didn't love him, not really. But she loved the power, the secret, the way he looked at her as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. Yet guilt has a way of seeping in. One evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, Henry sat in the kitchen staring at his calloused hands. Melissa slipped in, as she always did, but this time he pulled away. "We can't keep doing this," he muttered. "It's killing me." Melissa leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Killing you? You think you're the only one carrying this? You're her sister, Henry snapped. You're supposed to protect her or not. Not what? Melissa's voice cracked. Not want something for myself? You think she's the saint and I'm the devil? Maybe I'm tired of living in her shadow. Henry dropped his face into his hands. This isn't love. It's poison. But the truth was, neither of them could stop. To the outside world, nothing had changed. Sarah still smiled as she prepared dinner. She still leaned against Henry's shoulder during church hymns. Melissa still cracked jokes that made Sarah roll her eyes. But the air in that house had thickened, heavy with secrets. Older folks in town might have called it what it was. Temptation, unchecked and unconfessed. And like all sins left to grow in silence, it was only a matter of time before the cost came due. On one particular night, Sarah walked into the living room to find Henry and Melissa sitting too close on the couch. She laughed it off, never suspecting. What are you two plotting? She teased. Henry jumped up, too quickly. Nothing. Just TV. Melissa forced a smile, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Sarah smiled at them both, her heart full of trust. She could not imagine that under her very nose, the two people she loved most were betraying her in the most devastating way possible. And neither Henry nor Melissa realized then that what they thought was passion was, in fact, the beginning of their ruin. The seed had been planted. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was here, gathering strength inside their very walls. It began with fatigue, small, almost invisible changes in Melissa that no one paid attention to at first. She was always a night owl, always restless, but now she woke each morning pale and drained. Her weight slipped away, little by little, until Sarah began to fuss over her. You're not eating enough, Sarah scolded gently one evening, setting a plate of fried chicken in front of her. You used to out-eat Henry. Melissa forced a laugh, but her fork barely touched the food. She pushed the chicken around the plate, her appetite gone. Henry sat across the table, his jaw tight, eyes flicking between the two sisters. He said nothing. The weeks passed, and Melissa grew weaker. A cough lingered, her cheeks hollowed, her skin lost its glow. Finally, against her stubbornness, Sarah insisted she see a doctor. The day of the appointment, Melissa sat in the cold waiting room, staring at the posters on the wall about safe sex and infectious diseases. Her heart thudded as the nurse called her name. Blood drawn, questions asked, and then that terrible silence as she waited for results. When the doctor finally returned, his face carried the kind of grave sympathy that spoke louder than words. He closed the door softly, sat across from her, and folded his hands. Melissa, he said gently, your test came back positive. You've contracted HIV. The world collapsed around her. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't hear anything but the rushing in her ears. HIV. The three letters wrapped around her like chains. She saw her future vanish, the possibility of children, the dream of health, the illusion of safety. Her hands trembled as she clutched the paper with her results. There must be a mistake. The doctor shook his head slowly. I'm afraid not. Melissa stumbled out of the clinic into the bright sunlight, but everything looked dim, gray. She climbed into her car, slammed the door, and broke down sobbing. After minutes that felt like hours, she grabbed her phone with shaking hands and called the one person she both needed and hated in that moment. Henry. When he answered, his voice was casual. What's up? Her words tumbled out, jagged and raw. I tested positive, Henry. HIV. Do you hear me? I have HIV. Silence. Then a sharp inhale. That's not possible. You're the only one, she screamed into the phone, her voice cracking. You're the only man I've been with. This came from you. Henry's voice hardened, defensive. No, don't you dare put this on me. You don't know what you've been doing. Don't you dare, she spat. Don't you dare blame me. You gave this to me, and you've been lying to Sarah every single night. The line went quiet. Then Henry muttered through clenched teeth. You keep your mouth shut. Do you understand? No one can know about this. But Melissa wasn't a woman who could stay silent forever. For days she wrestled with her secret, consumed by rage and despair. She avoided Sarah's eyes, avoided Henry's touch. When Sarah asked if she was okay, she'd force a smile and change the subject. But the truth weighed heavier each day, pressing down on her chest until she could no longer breathe beneath it. One night, she confronted Henry in the dim kitchen while Sarah slept upstairs. I can't carry this alone, Melissa whispered, tears streaking her face. She deserves to know. Henry stepped closer, his voice a low growl. You tell her, and it'll destroy her. It'll destroy everything. Do you want that on your conscience? Melissa shook her head violently. You already destroyed everything. You infected me. God only knows if you've infected her too. His face twisted. Don't you say that. You're a coward, she spat. You ruined us both. Henry's hand slammed against the counter, making her flinch. If you tell Sarah, you'll regret it. I swear. But fear could not suppress guilt. Eventually, Melissa broke. One evening, as Sarah sat in the living room folding laundry, Melissa dropped onto the couch beside her, her whole body trembling. Sarah, she whispered, her voice thin, I have to tell you something. And it's going to hurt you. Sarah set down the clothes, alarm crossing her face. What is it? Melissa's eyes filled with tears. I've been with Henry. The words fell like stones, shattering the room's quiet. Sarah's mouth opened, then closed, her face draining of color. You with Henry? No, you wouldn't. It's true, Melissa choked out. And it's worse. I'm sick. I tested positive for HIV. Sarah's hands shot to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Oh God. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Melissa sobbed. But you need to know. You have to get tested. Sarah sat frozen, her heart splintering, her whole world tilting on its axis. The man she loved, the sister she trusted, both had betrayed her in the cruelest way imaginable. The next morning, Sarah drove herself to the clinic, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She sat in the waiting room with her Bible clutched to her chest, whispering prayers under her breath. Lord, please let me be clean. Hours later, she received her result. Negative. Relief washed over her, but it was laced with fury. The betrayal cut too deep to be soothed by relief alone. She thought of all the nights she'd lain beside Henry, all the times she'd trusted Melissa under her roof. Her chest heaved with grief that turned quickly into rage. That evening, Sarah confronted Henry in their bedroom. She held the test result in her hand, her voice trembling but firm. I know everything, she said. You slept with my sister. You gave her HIV. You could have killed me. Henry's face went pale. He reached for her, but she pulled back. Sarah, listen. No, she snapped, her voice rising with years of suppressed pain. Don't you dare try to explain. You took vows before God. You destroyed our family. You shamed me. You risked my life. Henry's shoulders sagged, his face twisted with shame. I was weak. I made a mistake. A mistake. Sarah's voice cracked with disbelief. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. This is evil. For the first time, Henry saw something in Sarah's eyes he had never seen before. Not love, not even anger, but utter contempt. You've taken everything from me, she whispered. Everything. And in that moment, Henry realized the truth. There was no forgiveness coming. That night, the house was a battlefield of silence. Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, tears soaking her pillow. Henry sat in the dark kitchen, his hands shaking, his mind racing with fear. He had been exposed. The life he had built, the reputation he had cherished, the marriage he had leaned on. It was all unraveling. And deep down, a darker fear gnawed at him. If Sarah told the world, if the town found out, his life would be destroyed. What neither of them knew was that destruction was already closer than either dared to imagine. For 2 nights, Sarah barely slept. She lay on her side of the bed, staring into the dark, her body stiff as stone while Henry turned and shifted beside her, restless, breathing heavy. She could feel the gulf between them widening, as if the mattress itself had split into 2 worlds, hers, full of grief and fury, and his, filled with dread. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Melissa's tear-streaked face, heard the trembling confession, I've been with Henry. I have HIV. The betrayal replayed in her mind like a broken record, each repetition cutting deeper. Sarah had always believed evil was something that lurked outside, on the evening news, in distant cities, in stories whispered by neighbors about other people's families. But now she understood the cruelest truth of all. Evil had been sitting across from her at the dinner table, kissing her forehead at night, holding her hand in church. On the 3rd morning, she rose early, her movements quiet but sharp. She brewed coffee, her hands trembling as she poured the steaming liquid into her cup. When Henry wandered in, his hair tousled, she couldn't even look at him. "Morning," he muttered, trying for normalcy. Sarah set the cup down hard, the sound echoing in the still kitchen. "Don't." He froze. "Don't what?" "Don't pretend," she said, her voice raw. "Don't act like this is a normal morning in a normal marriage." Henry sighed, rubbing his face. "Sarah, I told you, I was weak. It was a mistake. I never wanted to hurt you." Her eyes flared, glistening with tears. "A mistake doesn't destroy a woman's life. A mistake doesn't infect my sister with a death sentence. A mistake doesn't risk killing me." He opened his mouth, then closed it. There were no words that could reach her now. Later that day, Sarah drove back to the clinic for her follow-up appointment. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and fear. She sat among strangers, each clutching their own secrets, their own silent prayers. When the doctor called her in, she braced herself. He explained her results carefully, kindly. "You're negative, Mrs. Collins. You haven't contracted HIV." Relief surged through her, but it was bittersweet. She wasn't sick, but her marriage was. Her family was. Everything she had trusted was diseased. Walking out of the clinic, Sarah felt the crisp autumn air sting her face. She pulled her cardigan tight around her shoulders, but the chill came from within. She whispered a prayer, not for deliverance, but for strength. Strength to face the man who had ruined everything. That evening, the confrontation erupted. Sarah stood in their bedroom, clutching the paper in her hands, the proof of her test, her fragile shield. Henry leaned against the dresser, his eyes bloodshot, his body heavy with dread. "I'm clean," she said flatly, waving the paper. "But Melissa isn't, and that's on you." Henry's jaw tightened. "I didn't. Don't you dare lie again," she snapped. "You betrayed me with my own sister. You put me in danger. Do you understand what you've done?" His shoulders slumped. For the first time, his bravado cracked, and he looked almost small. "Sarah, I'm sorry." Her voice shook, but it was laced with steel. "Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't give her life back. Sorry doesn't erase the image of you touching her the way you touched me." Henry reached for her, but she stepped back. Don't you touch me again." He dropped his hand, shame flooding his face. "I never stopped loving you." Sarah laughed bitterly, a sound more like a sob. "Love? You don't even know what the word means." In the days that followed, Sarah withdrew. She moved through the house like a ghost, her silence heavier than any argument. She avoided Henry's gaze, avoided his voice, avoided his presence altogether. At night, she lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, thinking of the years she had devoted to a man who had gutted her soul. Memories once sweet now felt poisoned. Their wedding day ruined. Their anniversaries ruined. Every kiss, every tender word, every whispered prayer at bedtime ruined. She thought of her parents, who had adored Henry. She thought of the church community, who saw them as a model couple. She thought of the whispered gossip that would explode once the truth came out. And most of all, she thought of Melissa, her baby sister, her blood, now facing a death sentence because of Henry's sins. One Sunday, Sarah forced herself to church. She sat in the pew, her Bible open in her lap, but her mind far from the sermon. Pastor Williams preached about forgiveness, about the parable of the prodigal son. Sarah stared at the wooden cross above the pulpit, her lips pressed thin. Forgiveness. Was she capable of it? Could any human heart forgive a betrayal this monstrous? Her hands clenched the Bible tighter. She whispered to herself, "Some sins don't deserve forgiveness." Meanwhile, Henry grew desperate. He saw the walls closing in. Melissa's silence was fraying, her guilt too heavy to keep hidden. Sarah's eyes burned with hatred. He knew that if Sarah told the town, his life would crumble. His reputation, his friends, his work, his faith community, all gone. One night, as rain lashed against the windows, he tried again. He found Sarah in the living room, staring into the fire. "We can get through this," he said, his voice strained. "We can move away, start over, just us. No one has to know." Sarah turned to him slowly, her face illuminated by the firelight, her eyes cold. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't just a mistake to hide. This is who you are now. A liar. A cheater. A man who destroys the women closest to him." Henry swallowed hard, panic rising in his chest. If you tell the church, I'll lose everything." Sarah stood, her voice rising, trembling with rage. "Good. You deserve to lose everything. You already lost me." Her words hung in the air like a death sentence. That night, Henry lay awake in their bed, sweat soaking the sheets. He stared into the dark, his mind racing. He had built his life on an image, a faithful husband, a good Christian, a reliable man. Now, that image was crumbling into dust. And Sarah had the power to finish him. One word from her, one confession to the community, and everything would be over. For the first time, a thought crept into Henry's mind, a thought so dark he shuddered. What if she never told? What if she could never tell? The storm outside rattled the windows, but inside Henry's chest, a darker storm had begun. The storm rolled in just after sunset, a restless wind rattling the shutters and driving sheets of rain across the darkened streets. In the Collins home, the air felt just as electric, tense, heavy, charged with words left unsaid. Sarah stood at the bedroom dresser, her hands trembling as she tore through a drawer, pulling out photographs, cards, remnants of a marriage she now considered a lie. Each picture landed on the floor with a slap. Their wedding day, his arm around her waist, a Christmas morning by the tree, anniversaries, birthdays, memories that once meant everything. Henry stood in the doorway, his chest heaving. "What are you doing?" Sarah spun on him, her eyes blazing. "I'm done pretending. I'm done living in this sham of a marriage. Tomorrow, I'm telling everyone, our families, the church, the whole town. They deserve to know the truth about you." Henry's stomach dropped. The words hit him like a bullet. Tomorrow, she was really going to do it. Everything he feared, humiliation, ruin, exposure, was just hours away. "You can't," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm outside. Sarah laughed bitterly. "Watch me." Her words cut deeper than any knife. Henry stepped further into the room, his hands outstretched, his voice cracking. "Sarah, please. I can't survive this. You'll destroy me." "You destroyed yourself," she snapped. "You destroyed me. You destroyed my sister. Do you even know what you've done?" For a moment, silence pressed between them, broken only by the thunder overhead. Henry's breath came shallow, his thoughts racing. He saw his life flash before him. The church pews, the factory, the neighbors' smiles. All of it slipping away, all of it crumbling because Sarah wouldn't stay silent. "Please," he whispered again, stepping closer. But Sarah's face hardened. She shoved the photos at his chest, the paper crumpling against him. "You're a monster, and I will not carry your lies one more day." Something snapped. Henry's hands shot out before he even realized what he was doing. He grabbed her wrists, trying to stop her, trying to hold back the avalanche of her fury. She screamed, twisting, fighting against him. The photographs scattered across the carpet, their faces frozen in happier times, now trampled underfoot. "Let go of me," she cried, her voice raw. "Sarah, stop," he shouted, his grip tightening. "Don't do this." But she wouldn't stop. Her rage gave her strength. And for the first time in their marriage, she looked at him not with love, not with fear, but with hatred. "You disgust me," she hissed. "I wish I had never married you." Those words seared him. In his panic, in his desperation, his hands shifted from her wrists to her throat. At first, it was instinct, an attempt to silence the scream building in her chest. But then it became something else. His fingers pressed harder, digging into her skin as thunder cracked above the house. Sarah clawed at his arms, her nails raking his flesh. Her legs kicked against the dresser, sending a lamp crashing to the floor. The room erupted in chaos, lightning flashing through the curtains as Henry's face twisted with fear and rage. "Don't," he cried, even as his hands betrayed him. "Don't take this from me." Her eyes widened, tears spilling as she struggled for air. She tried to speak, tried to form his name, but the sound caught in her throat. For one final second, her gaze locked with his, a look not of forgiveness, but of devastating clarity. Then her body went limp. Henry froze, the storm roaring outside as silence fell inside the room. His hands still clutched her neck, but she no longer fought back. Slowly, trembling, he released her. She collapsed onto the carpet, her hair fanning out, her lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. Henry staggered backward, his chest heaving, his own sobs ripping from him like an animal in pain. He pressed his hands to his face, feeling the sting of her nails in his skin, the sweat dripping from his brow. "My God," he whispered hoarsely. "What have I done?" The room around him looked like a battlefield. Shattered glass from the lamp glittered on the floor. Photographs lay scattered, the smiling faces of their past staring up in silent judgment. And Sarah, his wife, his anchor, his victim, lay motionless among them. For several minutes, he stood frozen, his mind blank, his body numb. The storm outside pounded against the windows, as if the heavens themselves raged against him. Finally, he sank to his knees beside her, reaching for her hand, hoping against hope that he might feel warmth, a pulse, some sign that it wasn't too late. But the truth was undeniable. Sarah was gone. Down the street, a neighbor heard the crash of the lamp, the muffled cries, the sound of chaos in the Collins home. Concern grew. In this small town, disturbances were rare, and storms often made tempers flare. The neighbor picked up the phone, dialing the sheriff's office. Inside, Henry sat beside Sarah's body, rocking slightly, whispering words to a woman who could no longer hear him. "I didn't mean it. I swear, I didn't mean it." But intent didn't matter now. The deed was done. The secret he had tried to bury with lies had birthed something even darker: murder. And before the storm outside could pass, the storm inside those walls would bring the law pounding on his door. The storm had barely quieted when the flashing lights arrived. Red and blue cut through the sheets of rain as deputies stepped onto the porch of the Collins home, their boots splashing in puddles. The neighbor who called stood on the sidewalk in her robe, clutching her umbrella tight, her face pale with worry. Inside, Henry sat slumped against the wall of the bedroom, his hands caked with sweat and dirt, his eyes hollow. Sarah's body lay still on the carpet, framed by the fallen photographs and the shattered lamp. He didn't move when the deputies burst in, didn't speak when they barked his name. He looked less like a man and more like a ghost who had already left his body behind. "Clear the room," one of the deputies shouted. But there was nothing left to clear. Sarah was gone. Detective James Parker arrived minutes later. A veteran of 20 years, Parker had seen enough crime scenes to know the difference between an accident and a killing. The moment he stepped into that bedroom, he felt the weight of the truth pressing down. The overturned furniture, the broken glass, the bruises on Sarah's throat. It told a story louder than Henry's silence ever could. Parker crouched beside the body, his face grim. He glanced at the deputies. "Get the husband cuffed. We'll question him downtown." Henry barely resisted as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. His voice came out hoarse, almost childlike. "It wasn't supposed to happen. I just wanted her to stop." Parker's jaw tightened. He had heard that excuse too many times before. At the station, the interrogation room felt colder than usual. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on Henry's weary face. Detective Parker slid a folder onto the table and leaned forward. "You know why you're here," Parker said, his tone even. "Your wife is dead, and from where I'm standing, it looks like you put your hands around her throat." Henry rubbed his face, his cuffed hands trembling. "I didn't mean to." She was yelling, throwing things. "I just lost control." Parker opened the folder, pulling out photographs from the scene. He slid one across the table, the image of Sarah's lifeless eyes staring upward. "This isn't losing control, Henry. This is murder." Henry's breathing quickened. "You don't understand. If she told people, everything would be over. My job, my church, my life." I panicked. The words hung in the air. Parker leaned back, watching him. "So you admit it. You killed her because you were afraid of the truth coming out." Henry shut his eyes, his face crumpling. "I didn't want her dead. I just wanted her quiet." Meanwhile, Melissa was brought in for questioning. She sat rigid in her chair, her eyes red from crying, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Tell us about your relationship with Henry," Parker pressed. Her voice cracked. We were involved. Behind Sarah's back. I'm ashamed, but it's the truth." Parker's eyes narrowed. "And the HIV?" Tears streamed down her face. "I tested positive weeks ago. He's the only man I'd been with. He gave it to me. I told Sarah because she deserved to know." Parker scribbled notes. Every word sealed Henry's fate tighter. The affair, the infection, the confrontation, the motive. By morning, the town was buzzing. Word spread fast in places like this. Sarah Collins, beloved wife, faithful church member, quiet librarian, was dead, murdered in her own home. And the man accused? Her husband, the very man everyone thought was the salt of the earth. At the local diner, whispers filled the booths. "Did you hear? Henry killed her. And with her sister, of all people. Lord, have mercy." The betrayal cut deeper than the crime itself. People who once waved at Henry from their porches now spoke his name with disgust. Back at the station, Parker returned to the interrogation room. He placed a cup of coffee in front of Henry, untouched. "You've got one chance to come clean," Parker said. "One chance to tell Sarah's story the way it deserves to be told. Did you kill her to keep your secret?" Henry stared at the table, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't angry. It was the quiet collapse of a man who knew his life was over. Later that evening, Parker stood outside the Collins home, now wrapped in yellow tape. Reporters had gathered at the curb, their cameras flashing as the rain finally eased. Parker lit a cigarette, though he'd been trying to quit for years. He exhaled smoke into the damp air, his mind heavy. Another woman gone. Another family destroyed. Another man who chose violence over honesty. Why do they always think silence is worth a life? He muttered to himself. Melissa watched from a distance as Sarah's body was carried out on a stretcher. Her sobs shook her whole body. Her hands clutched to her chest. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," she whispered through the glass of her car window. "This is all my fault." But deep down, she knew this was Henry's sin. And now, he would pay for it. The investigation had only just begun, but the truth was already undeniable. Henry Collins, once the town's picture of decency, was now its greatest shame. And justice was no longer a question of if, but when. By the time the trial began, the Collins case had become the talk of the county. The courthouse steps overflowed with reporters, their cameras flashing as deputies escorted Henry inside in shackles. Once, people in town had greeted him with smiles and handshakes. Now, they looked at him with narrowed eyes and whispers that carried like smoke. "That's the man who killed his wife." Inside, the courtroom was packed. Every bench filled with neighbors, church members, co-workers, people who once admired Henry, now eager to see justice done. Sarah's parents sat in the front row, her mother clutching a handkerchief damp with tears. Melissa sat a few rows back, her face pale, her body trembling as if she might collapse under the weight of what she was about to do. At precisely 9 o'clock, the bailiff called the court to order. Judge Harrison, stern and seasoned, took his seat on the bench. His eyes swept the room, settling on Henry. "Bring in the defendant." Henry shuffled forward, his orange jumpsuit hanging loose on a frame that seemed smaller, weaker than before. He sat beside his attorney, avoiding the stares that burned holes in his back. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Doyle, rose first. She wasted no time. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear and strong. "This is not a case of a tragic accident. This is a case of betrayal, of lies, of violence. Henry Collins cheated on his wife with her own sister, infected that sister with HIV, and when confronted by the truth, he silenced Sarah Collins the only way he knew how, by wrapping his hands around her throat." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Sarah's mother sobbed openly, her shoulders shaking. Henry's attorney, a weary man with little ammunition, tried to soften the picture. "This was a man pushed past his breaking point," he said. "Yes, he made mistakes, terrible ones. But he did not wake up that morning intending to kill his wife. He lost control in a moment of passion, and while that is no excuse, it is not the same as premeditated murder." The jurors listened carefully, their faces unreadable. Then came the testimony. Melissa was called first. When her name was spoken, she rose on shaky legs, every eye in the courtroom following her. She took the stand, swore the oath, and sat down, clutching a tissue. The prosecutor approached gently. "Melissa, can you tell the court how your relationship with Henry began?" Melissa's voice wavered. "I was living with them. Sarah wanted to help me. But Henry, he started looking at me differently. At first, I thought it was nothing. But then, one night, we crossed a line." Her words spilled out, halting and broken, but clear enough to draw a collective gasp from the audience. She described the affair, her shame, and finally her illness. "I tested positive for HIV," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Henry was the only man I had been with. He gave it to me. When I told Sarah, she was devastated. She said she had to confront him. She wanted to tell the truth." "And what happened after that?" the prosecutor pressed. Melissa's sobs grew heavier. "The next night, she was dead." The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel for silence, but the damage was done. The jurors had seen Melissa's anguish, felt the weight of her words. Henry's attorney tried to discredit her. Isn't it true, Miss Collins, that you resented your sister? That you felt overshadowed by her? Isn't it possible you lied to hurt Henry? Melissa lifted her chin, her voice sharp despite her tears. I may have resented her sometimes, but I loved her. I would never lie about this. He killed her. He killed my sister. The gallery murmured in agreement. Detective Parker followed, laying out the evidence. The bruises on Sarah's throat, the overturned furniture, Henry's own words in interrogation. He spoke with the calm authority of a man who had no need to embellish the truth. Finally, the prosecutor brought Henry's signed statement to the jury. His own admission, I just wanted her quiet. It was the nail in the coffin. During closing arguments, Margaret Doyle stood before the jury, her voice rising with righteous conviction. This was not just a crime of passion. This was a man who chose betrayal, who chose lies, and when faced with the consequences, chose violence. Sarah Collins was a faithful wife, a beloved daughter, a woman who trusted the wrong man. And that man must be held accountable. She pointed directly at Henry. Do not let him escape the truth. Give Sarah justice. Henry's lawyer could only plead for mercy. He is flawed, yes, but he is human. Do not take his life for one terrible mistake. But the jurors' faces had already hardened. After hours of deliberation, the verdict came. The jury filed back into the courtroom, solemn, their eyes heavy. The foreman rose. We, the jury, find the defendant, Henry Collins, guilty of murder in the first degree. A wail escaped Sarah's mother. Melissa covered her face with her hands. The judge turned to Henry, his voice steady. You have been found guilty. Sentencing will follow, but make no mistake, the punishment will reflect the gravity of this crime. Henry's shoulders slumped, his face drained of color. For the first time, he looked like what he truly was. Not a respected husband, not a pillar of the community, but a broken man whose own sins had destroyed him. When the gavel struck, the courtroom erupted in noise, some weeping, some whispering, some shaking their heads. Detective Parker stood silently at the back, his eyes on Melissa, who clung to the railing, her whole body trembling. Justice had spoken, but it brought no joy. Sarah was still gone. Melissa still carried the weight of her illness. And Henry still sat shackled, his eyes vacant, his fate sealed. The trial was over, but the tragedy of the Collins family would linger long after the courtroom emptied. The day of sentencing dawned gray and cold. The courthouse, usually just another brick building in the center of town, felt like a stage where history was about to be written. Word had spread quickly. Today, Henry Collins would learn his fate. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with anticipation. Every bench was filled, every whisper hushed as Judge Harrison entered and took his seat. The bailiff called for order, and the silence was almost suffocating. Henry was led in, shackled, wearing the same orange jumpsuit he had worn throughout the trial. But something had changed in him. The arrogance was gone, the excuses gone. He looked hollowed out, a man whose own sins had eaten him alive. His eyes darted briefly toward Melissa, then away, as if the weight of her presence was too much to bear. Judge Harrison began, his voice steady and firm. Henry Collins, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of the crime of first-degree murder. This was not a crime of passion alone. This was a crime rooted in betrayal, in selfishness, in an attempt to silence the truth. He paused, letting the words sink in. The court has considered the evidence, the testimony, and the devastation you have caused. This was not only the murder of a wife but the destruction of a family, the betrayal of a community, and the reckless endangerment of another life. Henry stared at the floor, his hands trembling. Judge Harrison's voice hardened. For these reasons, this court sentences you to death by lethal injection. The words fell like thunder. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Sarah's mother wept openly, clinging to her husband's arm. Melissa buried her face in her hands, her body shaking as sobs overtook her. Henry lifted his head at last, his eyes wide, his face pale as parchment. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. He simply sat back, his chains rattling softly, the sound echoing in the silence of the courtroom. Afterward, as deputies escorted Henry away, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Questions flew. Do you think justice was served? Was death the right sentence? Some nodded grimly, satisfied that a murderer would pay the ultimate price. Others muttered that taking a life, even his, wouldn't bring Sarah back. In the front row of the gallery, Sarah's parents held hands. Her mother whispered through her tears, "At least she can rest now." Melissa lingered behind, staring at the empty defendant's chair. For her, the verdict was bittersweet. Her sister's killer would pay, but it didn't erase the damage. The disease still lived in her blood. The guilt still gnawed at her heart. And no sentence, no punishment, could undo the night her sister died. Detective Parker stood at the back, his arms folded, his face unreadable. To him, the death sentence was not triumph, but inevitability. Another case closed, another life lost to lies and violence. He watched Melissa leave the courtroom, her shoulders bowed, and he knew this story would haunt her forever. It would haunt him, too. As Henry was led down the corridor, his chains clinking against the tile floor, he finally spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper to the deputy at his side. "I never meant to kill her." But intention no longer mattered. The gavel had spoken. The law had spoken. His fate was sealed. In the weeks that followed, the town moved on outwardly, but the Collins case lingered in conversations, in sermons, in whispered warnings. Parents told their children, "This is what happens when you stray from truth." Pastors spoke about sin, secrecy, and the wages of betrayal. The story of Henry and Sarah Collins became a cautionary tale, a scar on the town's memory. Justice had come, but peace was harder to find. Months passed, yet the shadow of the Collins tragedy lingered like a scar that would not fade. The Collins home sat empty, its windows dark, the porch swing creaking in the wind. Neighbors avoided looking at it, as if even a glance might stir the ghosts inside. At the cemetery on a quiet Sunday afternoon, Sarah's parents stood by her grave. The headstone was simple, etched with words that spoke of love and loss. Beloved daughter, faithful wife, gone too soon. Her mother laid fresh lilies on the grass, whispering, "We tried to raise you to trust, sweetheart. We never imagined trust would cost you your life." Melissa visited often, too. She would sit by the grave for hours, speaking softly as if Sarah could still hear her. "I wish I could take it back," she confessed one day, her voice breaking. If I hadn't let him near me, you'd still be here." She pressed her hand to the cool stone, tears dripping down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I'll carry this forever." The town, once proud of Henry Collins, spoke his name only in hushed tones now. His death sentence was seen by some as justice, by others as another layer of tragedy. Pastor Williams, preaching weeks after the trial, summed up the sentiment that weighed on many hearts. Sin does not just destroy the sinner. It destroys everyone it touches. Detective Parker filed the case away, but not without a lingering ache. He'd seen plenty of men fall, but this one struck deeper, because it showed how quickly a life built on lies could collapse, taking innocent souls down with it. In the end, Sarah's story became more than a crime report. It was a cautionary tale whispered across dinner tables, retold in church pews, remembered in the silence of grieving hearts. A story of how betrayal and fear had turned a home into a tomb, and a husband into a killer. And though justice came in the form of a death sentence, it could never erase the loss. Sarah Collins was gone, her trust betrayed, her voice silenced. But in the memory of those who loved her, she lived on, as a reminder that truth hidden in the dark will always claw its way into the light.